Or two. There we go. Welcome once again, and I will turn it over to Ruth.
Thank you, Marita. So I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Brian Murray. He is the interim director of the newly merged Duke University Energy Initiative and Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions. Before the merger, Brian directed the Energy Initiative and previously served for 11 years as director of the Environmental Economics Program at the Nicholas Institute. Brian is widely recognized for his work on the economics of energy policy, particularly as it relates to the efforts to mitigate climate change risk. Brian served on a National Academy of Science panel to examine the effects of the U.S. federal tax code on energy-related greenhouse gas emissions, led by Nobel laureate William Nordhaus. He was an author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report on greenhouse gas mitigation from land use change. Throughout his more than 30-year career, Brian has written on topics ranging from the design of market-based environmental policies and the effectiveness of renewable energy subsidies to the evaluation of programs to protect natural habitats, such as forests, coastal and marine ecosystems. He has also been a contributor to Forbes on energy and environment. Brian wrote on Pope Francis's 2015 encyclical or papal letter to the bishops on the environment and climate, in which the Pope critiques consumerism and irresponsible development and laments environmental degradation and global warming. Brian and his wife Jean are members of Immaculata Conception Church in Durham. And last but not least, along with John and I, they are dedicated participants in, no pun intended, the award-winning tailgate crew in Duke's Blue Devil Alley.
Thank you. Thanks, Ruth. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, thumbs up. Good.
That sounds great. So it's really nice to be here with old friends, former coworkers. I even look out there and I see somebody I co-authored a paper with from Duke. Hi, David. So it's just really nice to be here. It was nice to lead off with a prayer from St. Francis of Assisi, Immaculate Conception, where Jean and I go, and where our children were baptized and raised in the faith. It is a Franciscan church, very much focused on creation care. So I guess the next thing I'm going to do is share my screen, and hopefully good things will happen when I do that. Now I just, I hate it when it does this, but I gotta sneak behind there, and I need to sneak behind here and
Get rid of the toolbar.
how do I,
Slideshow. Yeah.
where is it?
Right
I
where
had
you-
trouble that
oh,
time.
down top right there.
Yeah, but
Keep going to the right.
Yeah.
Slideshow.
Yeah, I know, but I can't see it.
Yeah.
Or you can see it, but I
Yeah.
can't.
See it, see it,
Okay,
see it.
gotcha. I'm gonna do it this way.
That is a lot of hand-eye coordination.
He hasn't done it yet, so.
Yeah.
I'll give you my credit.
Oh, okay.
I thought there was a way.
There
to
is
do
a
this,
way to remove the toolbar.
Unless,
But
do
you know what?
do you want to do not screen share first? Is that possible?
no, I'll get there. It's just, it's going very slowly is the
Yeah.
problem.
It's kind of, yeah.
Yeah, it's the way.
If you go to more, I think you can.
You can be so close.
It's going all the way over there. Okay. There's gotta be a better way. I thought at the bottom left, oh,
Yeah,
great.
at the bottom left there is the
Can
little
you
screen.
Pull the toolbar.
Yes, you can pull the toolbar down. Just grab and hold.
Yeah, that's right.
All right.
Oh, yes.
So that's all I have.
Yeah.
That's all I have for you tonight. I'm exhausted. Well, thanks again for inviting me here. And, this is you heard the introduction. So I work on climate change. I work on energy. I work on public policy. I'm an economist. So the first 10 slides are going to be about climate science. And so just take it with a grain of salt. I'm an economist. But I often want to give this talk, I start by talking about energy, and then I kind of work in, well, energy has a sort of side effect with it. It produces a lot of carbon dioxide, which is greenhouse gas, and I go on it that way. But I'm going to start with the climate here because I'm assuming that that is the common interest that we're starting with. Then I'll explain why, if you're interested in climate, if you're concerned about climate, it's good to know about how the energy sector works, how it contributes to the problems, and what is happening right now in the energy sector, often called the energy transition, energy transformation, to move away from the current system, which is very heavily dependent on fossil fuels, to alternative sources of fuels and energy that do not introduce greenhouse gases. So that's like a thumbnail sketch of what we're going to be talking about. So now here's your economist's 10-slide version of climate science. Okay, first is the greenhouse effect. So everyone knows what the greenhouse effect is. Essentially, what it is so we get all of our energy from the sun, everything, including fossil energy that was above ground biomass hundreds of millions of years ago. They got buried below ground. They call it fossil fuels because it was once organic matter. So coal, oil, natural gas, all of that is buried sediment, buried organic material. So everything comes from the sun. And when it hits the earth, most of the radiation bounces back. It either bounces off the edge of the atmosphere and heads out, so that has no impact on the earth, or it hits the earth's surface and it bounces back. And the most abundant molecules and the most abundant air gases in the atmosphere just let the sunlight go through without really doing anything to it. Greenhouse gases, which I've written at the bottom, are the primary ones are carbon dioxide, water vapor, methane, nitrous oxide, and then the fluorinated gases that we use for refrigerants. They have a certain interaction with solar radiation that essentially excites them and generates heat, and it traps heat close to the Earth's surface. And that essentially is the greenhouse effect. Now, if there were no CO2 in the atmosphere, no greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, that's just effectively what the Earth would look like, which is a big ice ball. So right now, anybody want to guess what the average global surface temperature is in Fahrenheit, like over the whole Earth, over the whole course of the year?
70.
48.
Right in between, 58 degrees Fahrenheit.
Ah.
Although it's getting warmer, but it's still close to 58. Without greenhouse gases, it'd be 0 degrees. And so there would be some, life that could survive that, but it wouldn't be the life that we know. So greenhouse gases are a good thing. Like a lot of things in life, you can get too much of a good thing. So here's the Paleoclimate Record. What does that mean? What we're doing here is we're tracking the relationship over the last 800,000 years, much of this data comes from ice cores from a place like Greenland. And we can track both what we know that the CO2 content in the atmosphere to be over time, and also there are paleo measures of what the temperature was through looking at the vegetation that existed and whatnot at the time. And what you can see here, carefully coded to be Carolina blue and Duke blue, is you see that they work in, if not exactly lockstep together, essentially CO2 and global surface temperature move together and have. There is no real mystery about this relationship. So part of the science we know. Okay, so what I have on the left here is the atmospheric CO2 concentrations over a fairly long period of time. And what we see is, we have, these are things like ice ages and warming periods. And we see that naturally they occur over extremely long periods of time, tens of thousands of years. And then starting about 200 years ago, we saw what was looking like it was going to be the peak of another cycle that would have turned, 10,000 years down the future. And our atmospheric concentrations of CO2 just took off from there. In fact, there really hasn't been, as it says here, there really hasn't been levels above 300 parts per million in the previous 800,000 years. And so we were getting close to that before things interceded. So since 1780, or essentially since the Industrial Revolution, through last week, latest measure from Mauna Lea volcano in Hawaii, there's been a 50% increase in global concentrations of greenhouse gases, CO2 in particular. The CO2 is the easiest one to measure. The other ones matter. But when you actually are doing policy and trying to figure out what's the impact of greenhouse gases on the atmosphere, everything that you translate to a CO2 equivalent. So whether it's methane or nitrous oxide, it translates to a CO2 equivalent. And so that's a pretty big increase. We know where it's coming from. It's not, there are ways that you can actually trace where is the CO2 coming from, and you can trace it to the burning of fossil fuels. So it's not just, I don't know, boy, maybe it just came in from outer space. We know where it's coming from. And we also know how much energy we're using. If we look at the global temperature records, and these are since 1880, where we have measured temperature throughout the world through different, well, now it's more weather satellites. It used to be buoys in the ocean. But as you can see, what we've got is, and this is all normalized around 0 degree anomaly here. And we see, if you look over the last 140 years, you see, if you look at the average, you see everything up to 1940 was below that average, and everything since 1980 has been above that average. And if you just drew a line right through there, you'd have a pretty nice fit that shows you that global temperatures are rising over time. Now, here's a little bit of a data visualization exercise, or maybe a I don't know, I guess holding people's feet to the fire exercise. So there was a period of time where a lot of political pundits were talking about, we're using this data, and they were picking, can we see this? Yeah, we can see where I'm pointing right now. So they look at that year, which is 1998, which is a really, really warm year. It was an El Nino year, and that tends to lead to global cycles. And so even looking at this data over time, what people were saying is, well, it hasn't gotten warmer in the last 10 years. It hasn't gotten warmer in the last 20 years, whatever. Because, well, they say that for about 15 years, because they say, well, look, they just draw a straight line from 1998 to their year and just say, see, this is not happening. And, Carol Mansfield, who's an economist who works on econometrics, and David McAdams, they would just say this is the first, violation of statistical laws. You don't look at single data points and connect it to. That's why you have multiple data points. So we can see a very strong temperature trend that has been occurring, and it's been accelerating since 1880. It's gone up about almost 1/10 of a degree C per decade, and then since 1981, it's been closer to twice that. The 6 warmest years on record have all been since 2015, the 10 warmest all since 2005. And these days, the new temperature record is set on average every 3 years since 1981. And before that, it was every 13 years. So, so things are changing for sure. What happens when it gets warmer? Well, ice melts. And so ice melts, and that's above ground. So you have to think about ice sheets in places like Greenland and Antarctica. And Antarctica's got weird stuff going on, because underneath the ice sheet, there's some growth, but then there's loss of above ground sheet. But Greenland is the real culprit, if you will, and there's losing huge amounts of volumes of fresh water coming into the ocean. That's one factor. The other factor is something I think all of us know from having taken 4th grade science, I guess, which is when water gets warmer, it expands. And so there's expansion going on in the ocean, and there's more water that is getting introduced into the ocean. And again, this has been going on in lockstep with temperature increases over this time period. So the next thing that we don't people don't spend quite as much time thinking or talking about, but unless you're an oceanographer or you're really into oceans. And that's ocean acidification. And essentially what ocean acidification is when the ocean absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere, it makes it slightly more basic. And it means that leads to, it makes it less basic. But it essentially converts that CO2 into bicarbonate acid. And at high enough volumes, you can start to detect that. And so in this chart right here, and I apologize for those of you who you're not supposed to call it colorblind anymore, but if you're colorblind, I apologize for the fact you probably cannot see the red and the green here. But essentially what we've got is the red, the top line there, the sawtooth line, for those of you who followed any climate science know that is the CO2 reading from the Mauna Lea Observatory in Hawaii. And it's got anybody want to guess why it has this sort of sawtooth look to it? Because this is real time. It monitors the CO2 all the time, like on a daily or monthly basis. So why might it be sawtoothed? Why does it change over the course of a year? And
Seasons.
Time of day.
seasons, right? So in the northern hemisphere is going through in the spring, it is absorbing a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere to create leaves. And when it goes through the fall, it's releasing that back into the atmosphere. So we see the sawtooth, but it's sawtooth up a steep curve, right? So the average is getting higher every single year. It's not like the temperature thing where sometimes it goes back. It is getting higher every single year because it's pretty simple atmospheric chemistry. When the CO2 goes in the atmosphere, it stays there for a very, very long period of time. And so there might be periods where it doesn't go up as much because the CO2 hasn't gone up as much. So I don't have a graph on this, but what happened 2 years ago? Does anybody know what happened to global CO2 emissions? Well, you know what happened to US?
Pandemic, right.
US CO2 emissions went down 9%. Globally, they sort of flatlined, or they might have even gone down just a little bit, but they picked right back up. Okay, and then if you're an insurance executive, you're thinking, what does this mean for all of the insurance, all of the insurable pools that I'm insuring? And what we're seeing is over time, these events are becoming more frequent, and what that means is essentially what are major climate-related events over time. Now, this is not dollars, this is a number of events, because if you do dollars, it gets contaminated a little bit because you have the size of the economy, you have inflation, you have other things. You say, well, that's just going up because the value of property is going up. But this is actual events and it's attribution to various different things. And so we're seeing a trend going up. So CO2 is going up, temperatures are getting warmer, we're seeing the effects physically and we're seeing the effects economically. End of your science story. Okay, so why are greenhouse gases rising? I've sort of led with this. Well, energy is responsible for 3/4 of all global emissions of greenhouse gases, and that's essentially oil, natural gas, which is sometimes co-produced with oil. That's traditionally how it had been until the invention and development and expansion of technology called hydraulic fracturing, which means you can go out and get natural gas without getting oil by going through rocks and turning sideways and pulling it all out. Turns out, actually, I try to stay as value neutral as we're talking about a religious organization, so I can be less, kind of value neutral. But the thing about natural gas, and I'll talk about this in a little bit when I go through a very complicated diagram, is natural gas really is actually what led. The United States actually produces about 20% less greenhouse gases in the US than we did in 2005. And a big part of that is our electric power system used to be 58% coal generation, and now it is 19% coal generation. And most of that has gone to natural gas, which produces the same amount of electricity, but with half the CO2 emissions. But now it's starting to be driven by this other transformation that I'm going to be talking about. Okay, pop quiz. What's the next largest source of emissions outside of energy? If you were paying careful attention to
Cows.
Ruth during my biography.
Yeah, methane.
Dude. Stop it, Maryland person. Okay, Yale person. Yeah, it's the food, it's food essentially. And so it's cows and it's, I'm pointing at my screen, but no one else can see me pointing at my screen. Cropping. And then also, and when you think, and particularly you think about places like Brazil and Indonesia, what's there? Forests are there, right? And so if you want to grow crops or if you want to raise livestock, you clear forest. And deforestation accounts for about 15% of global emissions, most of it in the Amazon, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, places like that. United States, not the case. It was at one time, but right now we have a fairly stable forest base. If we were standing here 100 years ago, that would not be forests, they would be fields, right? So, but anyway, but I'm here to talk about energy, although I will be happy to answer any questions about agriculture, forest, and that kind of thing. So I'm going to talk about what we mean by transition to a low carbon energy economy. And then I'm going to define the objectives, which are, so we want to produce, so the mantra for the energy initiative, which I've been leading, and we're not that distinct. A lot of people, a lot of organizations that work on energy talk about the goal is accessible, affordable, reliable, and clean energy. For a low carbon energy transition, we need to continue to produce that. We can't just say, well, one way to cut emissions would just be not to use energy anymore. I mean, there are actually people who advocate that. That's a pretty far bridge to travel. But what we want to do is we want to produce this, and we produce more of it, particularly think about parts of the world who don't even have access to electricity. There's still 800 million people on the face of the earth who do not have electricity. And we can't deny them their access to electricity just because we pumped a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere in producing our energy system. So we want to do it in a way that mitigates the risk to our climate system. So, okay, so what do we mean by decarbonization? This is the ugly diagram I was talking about, but I'll go through it very slowly. You're going to see it's actually a thing of beauty. It's not that ugly at this point, but just wait until the animation gets going. Okay. So what do we mean by decarbonization? Well, let's start by identifying. So this is a graph called a Sankey graph that will map things from the sources of energy to the uses of energy through, this is the US economy. And I can tell I'm already going to be pressing up against the hour just in this talk, but the global seminar, we'd have to pick a weekend. So I'm going to be talking, I got one slide at the end talking about global, but we're going to be talking about the US. So I'm going to take you through a US Sankey diagram. So we have high carbon primary sources of energy like coal and petroleum. And then we have, as I just described, median carbon and plus methane. Actually, natural gas is methane, which is a hydrocarbon. But methane itself is a greenhouse gas. Remember, so when natural gas leaks into the atmosphere, that's a potent greenhouse gas. It's a greenhouse gas that's 25 times more potent than CO2, but there's just a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere. So there's high carbon, there's medium carbon, and then these solar, nuclear, hydro, wind, and geothermal are all zero carbon. By zero carbon, what I mean by that is to produce the energy, it does not emit carbon dioxide. It doesn't mean, I mean, if you build a solar farm, you're going to burn greenhouse gases if you're using conventional industrial materials and fuel to build it. But this is all what we call tier 1 emissions, like at the actual facility itself. And then here under biomass, it depends whether or not, that can be actually zero carbon. If you've got a purely kind of recyclable system where you're growing plants, harvesting them for use in energy, and then growing the plants again, which is absorbing carbon dioxide, which is then using them for energy, just think of it as a big recycling exercise. If you do it that way, it's net zero. But if you're going out and just cutting trees down that otherwise would have stored carbon above ground and using them for energy, it's just like removing it from below ground, like a fossil fuel, but it's above ground. Okay, so here's the rest of the lovely diagram. So what I want you to simplify this a little bit, step back from the width of these lines and look to the far right. Okay, so the far right means like on the far left, we have where the primary energy comes from, where the fuels are that fuel our economy. And in the far right, you have what does it end up getting used for? So residential and commercial mean buildings. We're in a commercial building right now. So we use energy in order to run this building. Industrial is industrial processes, steel plants, cement plants, chemical plants. And then transportation is burning gasoline and diesel and other things and rocket fuel airplane fuel to move us around. So what's interesting there is that orange box in the top is electricity generation, right? So like essentially all of our coal is used for electricity generation. So think of that as like an intermediate product. So we use all of this zero carbon stuff. We use a bunch of our natural gas. We use all of our coal to produce electricity. And then electricity is used in residential households, commercial households, and industrial. And even a tiny little bar down there right now, but we're going to talk about how much bigger that's getting into the transportation sector. And then on the far right, we see that we actually waste most of the energy that we actually the potential energy that we have in what we mine and what we use. And a lot of that gets wasted. Anybody know how energy gets wasted?
Store it. Like electricity.
Yeah, so you can't store it. We'll get about that. But basically, you get loss in power lines. A big part of this, if you look at transportation, look at how much waste there is in transportation. Anybody know why? When your car's running, it produces heat, and it just is heat that goes into the atmosphere. It's not heat that is productively used to move your car. Okay, so one low carbon energy transition path, and the one that you're going to hear people talk about the most is let's decarbonize electricity and then electrify everything. So decarbonizing electricity is to move from the bottom part of that graph I just showed you, from fossil fuels to wind, solar, and we'll talk about nuclear. That's zero emissions, but it has other issues associated with it. So then you take that electricity and you can electrify transportation. You can electrify building, heating, and cooling. This is a bigger stretch in Canada than it is in North Carolina, where many of us have had heat pumps since we've lived here. I will say I used to have a heat pump and it kept me very, very, very cold at night. And then we moved to a house with a gas furnace and I was very warm at night and I liked that, but probably go back to the heat pump when it's time to replace the new. And then electrifying industrial processes, and that's the hardest thing. We're not really going to talk about that. It's just that's the hardest part. But we have we still have a ways to go with decarbonizing electricity and with electrifying everything. So so let's not worry about the last 10 or 15%. Let's just think about the first part. Okay. I can yammer on. I want to make sure I'm not done. Okay. So renewables. Okay. Well, renewables essentially take abundant sources of wind and sun. You know, we only use just a tiny fraction of the sun that hits the Earth's surface for productive energy use. So if you look at, and this is surprising to some people. So if you were to take a look, like the Energy Information Administration, who produced the graph on the left, you know, they track how much new electricity generating capacity is built in the United States each year. And what we've seen is right now, the new additions are primarily renewable. So there's a lot of solar being built. There's a lot of wind generation being built. And there's a little bit of gas being built. No one's building coal plants. They're closing coal plants down. There are some nuclear plants. I'm going to talk about nuclear in a few slides, but there are some nuclear plants that are being built. The first one's in 30 years. And the investors in those utilities have, well, two companies have filed bankruptcy and the other ones wish they had. So it's an expensive endeavor. But most of what we're seeing built right now is renewable, not only in the US, but throughout the world.
I was just going to ask, I thought China was building coal plants.
They are, yeah, so they're not building coal plants in the US, but they are building coal plants in China and they are building coal plants in India. and they are building. I think Indonesia is on the cusp of saying they won't do it anymore. But I mean, one of the things is when push comes to shove, unless countries receive really strong incentives for doing so, they're going to look for their cheapest source of energy. Now, one of the reasons, though, that this number is going up is that that wind and solar are increasingly becoming, under the right circumstances, which are broadening, the cheapest sources of electricity generation, actually. So, and that happens with economies of scale. So what we've got here on the left is we have a 19th century windmill over there that you might have found in Holland. And we look and see what those have looked like over time in terms of the size. And the wind turbines are getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So that, for instance, like in 2015, we're building them as big as the Eiffel Tower. And then in 2025, gosh, is that the one in Shanghai? Anyway, they're really big. 15 megawatts. What does that mean? That's just a number. That means that at any one time, as that wind turbine is turning, it can power 15,000 homes. One wind turbine. Now, these big ones tend to be out by the coast, and I'll talk about that. Okay, and then you've got these big solar farms out there. And so these are utility scale operations. This is not the stuff that you put on the roof of your house. And what's happened is over time, and this is just a graph, on the left, it basically just shows that the real cost of generating electricity for wind over the last 10 years, when this was done, I should have replaced it with the 2021 one, I apologize, 70% reduction in the cost of wind, and that's unsubsidized, and wind does receive subsidies, and a 90% reduction in unsubsidized solar cost of electricity generation. So that's why we're starting to see this ramp up, in addition to the fact that they've got subsidies. And so a lot of people are like, well, if it's so cheap, why do they need subsidies? That's it's not cheap everywhere. But there's definitely some windfall profits happening to those who can produce electricity cheaply and are getting subsidies for it. But one of the things that's happened is because of these policies, because of these subsidies, has allowed these economies of scale to happen, right? So economies of scale require scale. And so you need this kind of like push-pull thing, right? Like there has to be some incentive for somebody to spend more money to build a wind turbine, like 10 years ago. So they were getting subsidized. And then as you built more and more, and we can thank the Germans, by the way, for heavily subsidizing their wind and solar industry over there. I mean, solar, well, I go to Germany when I think about solar energy, right? So, but they subsidize it, which means that, and then China is doing it in a big way. That means all of this scale is produced cheaper and cheaper units. So there are some technical challenges. I bet you can guess one of them, with the variability of supply and demand. So for instance, solar energy, even in the summer, it still gets dark at some points. And so this graph right here, that the yellow, or from here it looks like it's red, but let's call it orange. A graph is the output from solar generation throughout the day. And the black line is the demand for electricity throughout the day. So we see that there are chunks of the day by which supply is greater than demand. Now, if you're producing what we economists call widgets, or if you're producing corn, or if you're producing oil, if you produce more than is being consumed at one time, what does that mean? You just store it, right? So you store it and sell it tomorrow or next week, or But with electricity, you need it when you need it, right? So you can't just say, well, I'll hold on to that electricity. But there are solutions, right? Including storage. So that's what batteries are for. So it turns out, though, at this point in time, most of the electricity storage in the United States actually comes from something called pumped hydro. So you use the renewable energy to pump water up into a reservoir when you've got abundant solar energy, like more than you need to feed the grid. And then at night, or maybe before night, if it turns out it becomes cloudy, then you can release water from the reservoir and you've got a hydro dam. So that's one way to do it. You can, but now they're really building, and the investments are staggering in the US and abroad, how much is going into grid level energy storage. So big batteries. And, lithium, starting with lithium ion, like every other battery that we have out there, but expanding into other technologies because there are supply chain challenges with that. Another thing you can do as a solution here is extend the grid, right? So there's some places that are really good for producing renewable energy, and there are other places that are not so good. If you have a fully extensive grid that covers like the entire continent, which we largely do, except Texas, they have their own grid and they had their own problems last year as a result of that. But if you can move the electrons around, that helps, right? That's actually like a form of storage, because if you build a lot of solar and wind out west, like we've seen, and you pump it into the grid, they are not consuming it out there or consuming it back east where the people are. The problem with extending the grid is people don't want things in their backyard. This is an actual scene from a protest in Maine for a clean energy transmission corridor coming in from Quebec, where all of the electricity is zero carbon, through Maine into Massachusetts. And the protest and the voters shot it down. They did not end up building that, or they have not. This was last year. They have not ended up building that. So I've got a friend and a former colleague at Duke. His name is Jim Salzman. He's an environmental lawyer, and he wrote an article a couple of years ago with a colleague of his saying when the Green New Deal meets the old green laws. And so, NEPA, other kinds of environmental laws have been to protect people against things being run that they don't want in their neighborhood. And then carbon capture and storage means you could still run fossil plants, but the CO2, instead of going up into the atmosphere, can be retained and injected below ground. So then that would be a way to just have more integration of what's called dispatchable electricity with the energy. So, but all of these things have their challenges. I mentioned I'll be talking about nuclear. Nuclear has been, I referred to some plants that were under, so we hadn't built a new nuclear plant since the 1990s. Several of them started at the beginning part of the last decade. There were 4, 2 in South Carolina, 2 in Georgia. Since nuclear plants are not something that you just like decide to build and build them cheaply, right? You've got to be building a whole bunch at a time, like we were in the 1970s, in order to get that scale effect that I was talking about. Well, that wasn't happening. And so Westinghouse, that was building these plants, actually did go bankrupt. They got kind of bailed out by Toshiba. And then Toshiba was on the ropes as a result of this. Anyway, long story short, the 2 plants in South Carolina shuttered. They closed down. These are big old nuclear plants like we have at Sharon-Harris. And then the 2 in Georgia, because they have more, a bigger rate base in Georgia, and they just convinced the utility commission to let them charge the customers. And so they're finishing those nuclear plants. Okay, so why am I so excited about nuclear plants? It doesn't sound like a very good solution. Those big old light water nuclear reactors that we see on The Simpsons are not really going to be the solution. But what could be the solution is what's called small modular reactors that can be built in like 50 megawatt packs. And what's good about that is they can be manufactured actually at a facility and then shipped to the location where they're needed, and they can be built and they can be ramped up and ramped down, and they're much, much safer. So there's a lot of investment going on here. There's some pilot sites going on. This is one of Bill Gates' companies is focused on these new advanced nuclear reactors. Okay, electrification and transportation. On the left, we have the global sales of battery electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles over the last decade. And on the right, we have that in the United States. They have similar patterns. And so a question is, are we hitting an inflection point right now? We've seen a nearly doubling, and globally, we saw more than doubling of EV sales in 2021. And in the US, I think it was an 80% increase, and it's expected to grow even more. 8.3% of new vehicles globally are electric vehicles. And just 5 years ago, they were 1%. So, okay, small base, you get big growth rates from a small base. The real question is, where is it going to go from here? Is it going to continue to grow? When you hear what the companies are talking about, I mean, GM, Volvo, most of the major companies have said they've committed to go essentially all electric sometime around 2035 or 2040. And they're building plants that are going to do that. So, a lot of people say, well, do the companies really mean it? Well, they're spending billions and billions of dollars to do it. Now, some people are saying, and they're going to be sorry, but if it's a combination of them building it, if the infrastructure for charging gets built, and if laws require it, it's all going to kind of fit together, right? Okay, so one of the big messages here, of course, is the policy matters, and it matters a lot. Again, even the technology advances I was talking about, they were essentially started with policy. So what is the government's role in fostering an energy transition? Well, when we look at the United States in particular, but throughout the world, this is less true than in the United States, it's still largely true. Energy decisions are basically private decisions. Almost all energy is produced by the private sector. Duke Energy is a for-profit company. They're a regulated company because they are being given monopoly power. But they have shareholders. They're making money. Other parts of the country, they're not regulated, and they're just anyway. They're all about making money, right? So, and though there are some who would say, well, we should just appropriate them and nationalize everything. That's a tough road to hoe. And about 70% of all energy R&D is conducted by the private sector. So what is the government's role? Government does produce some electricity, like Bonneville Power Authority and Tennessee Valley Authority. But what the government can do is fund early stage R&D. They can set targets for either types of electricity or emissions. They can set a price for carbon. And again, I teach a whole course in that. So if anyone has any questions about that, I can ask, but I decided not even to go there. And then establish and enforce market rules. Okay, so I'll give you an example of where policy can make a difference. So this is where the sun shines in the United States, right? So unsurprisingly, Southwest gets all the beautiful sun. Northeast, Midwest, not so much. Here's where the solar farms are in the United States, utility scale solar farms. So if we look out west, we see a lot of sun and policy incentives. Although if we really look back there, I mean, there's a lot of places where there's a lot of sun, they don't have a lot of solar farms, and that's because the policies really aren't there for it. So we do that, and then if we look east, we see less sun but more policy. What do you see there in our home state? That's a lot. Yeah, until last year, North Carolina was number 2 in installed solar capacity behind California, of course. It's because of a couple things. One of them is we have, along with 29 other states, something called a renewable portfolio standard, which mandates that a certain percentage of the electricity produced in the state comes from renewable sources. And then the other one is way wonky. It has to do with how the state interpreted a federal regulation about what constitutes new advanced energy. And it turns out in North Carolina, all you have to do is convince the utility commission that if you're building something, you're replacing the most expensive alternative source of energy, not the average source of energy. So that really made it friendly territory for solar. And so like a lot of Eastern North Carolina is in solar.
And that's not how, that's industrial, not housing, right? Like not people putting on their.
Yeah, it's 90 in North Carolina. I'd say 99% of it is utility scale solar. And we'll see. You can see when you drive around. You go down 85, like up towards Greensboro. You see. So, but if you go in the east, if you go down east, if you were up in a helicopter or something like that, you'd see a lot more of it than you can from the road. But there's an awful lot. So, and as a result, actually, there's a couple of really significant solar developers in the Triangle as well, like Strata Solar and Cypress Creek. They've moved from other parts of the country to here. Okay, so these renewable portfolio standards throughout the country have been part of what's driven that demand that led to the economies of scale that I was alluding to. North Carolina has a new clean energy bill. Did you know that? So in the fall, the governor signed a bill that was, did I write- yeah, I did write down a bill that was years in the making, but it passed a highly divisive legislature that we have by a whopping margin, 90-20 in the House and 42-7 in the Senate. And and essentially what it requires is it requires the state's utilities, essentially Duke Energy, to have a 70% reduction in carbon emissions by the year 2030. That's below 2005 levels. So we're a good chunk of the way there, because one of the, in which, is it the Easley administration? I think passed something called the clear smokestacks rule. And that led to elimination of a lot of coal plants that existed back in 2005, but have since been closed down. So, but this is going even further. Duke Energy, the company, is slated to release their clean carbon plan for how they're going to achieve these goals. And it will lead to increased rates. And it's a pretty far-reaching goal. So that, Duke Energy is going to be putting poles in the ground, so to speak. And that's what our state's going to be like. One of the things that I tossed some slides in the back. I didn't go through wind, but one of the things I should mention is I talked about those big wind turbines. Well, offshore wind is now here to happen. In fact, this week there's a lease that's being bid off of the coast of Wilmington, called Wilmington East, and it'll be part of the, I think it's a 40 or 50 gigawatt plan up the whole East Coast for offshore wind. 1 gigawatt is basically a nuclear power plant's worth of electricity. So it's a lot of electricity. I'm part of a team at Duke that has a study funded by the Department of Energy, and working with a bunch of ecologists, but I'm kind of leading the liaison group with the industry. How can you build these in ways that aren't disruptive to sea mammals, seabirds, birds and bats? So it's a really exciting opportunity, but it's a really big responsibility as well. So I'm going to just close with some stuff on federal climate policy action and say, back in 2006, Supreme Court case called Massachusetts versus EPA determined that EPA did have the authority to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. So that meant now that once they determined whether greenhouse gases were a dangerous pollutant, which that came into an administration who did make a determination, that meant that the EPA was obligated to regulate greenhouse gases in some way. So right after the Mass versus EPA ruling, there was something called a federal cap and trade bill, which is going to be a comprehensive reduction in greenhouse gases across the entire economy, 85% by 2050. And it was going to cap emissions from all these sectors, and it was going to allow all of the those who were subject to a cap to trade permits with each other in order to meet that cap, and that cap would be going down. So when you make something tradable, that gives it what? It gives it a price, a value. So if I have to buy a permit to emit a ton of CO2 from my coal plant, that's now costing me. It used to be free to do that. It's now costing me. It gives me an incentive to move away from coal. And when I left RTI, where I worked with Carol, and I came over to Duke, this is kind of what I worked on for 10 years, including actually helping advise this committee right here, including Congressman Waxman, on how they could design a bill like that would achieve their emissions goals, but in a way that was less disruptive economically. Well, that made it through the House of Representatives, but it died in the Senate, kind of right as the Great Recession was coming around, the last one that we had. So when President Obama was elected in 2009, he started with a fairly aggressive set of climate policies. The Paris Accord wasn't actually signed until the end of his term, but he sort of brought the U.S. back into international negotiations that his predecessor, President Bush, had sort of pulled from. He that because that big cap and trade bill didn't pass, he advanced something called the Clean Power Plan, which capped emissions from power plants, regulated methane from oil and gas production, and then revamped auto efficiency standards so that they were going to get 56 miles per gallon, 54 miles per gallon by 2026. When President Trump was elected, I mean, pretty much what he did is he just reversed it, all of Obama's policies. And one of the reasons is because it's very hard to get things through Congress. Like this bill passed one part of Congress, the first one I talked about, couldn't get through the other part of Congress. So then it becomes, if you feel as president you were elected to do something about it, you have to use the authorities that you have as in the executive branch. And they're not as far reaching and they're always subject to court challenge. So President Trump reversed most of Obama's policies. Many of those were taken to court and ended up getting reversed so that by the end of his term, and so then President Biden come in and he's reversed Trump's reversals and then sort of worked on the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which has a lot of energy provisions in it. But the big kahuna was going to be the Build Back Better bill, which had over $500 million of climate and energy provisions in it. And that stalled and seems unlikely to go anywhere anytime soon, unless there's a surprising shift of momentum in November. And then, so again, utilizing existing EPA authority, and then federal procurement. So like I put in a little figure right there about Biden administration's plans for procuring federal vehicle electric fleet. Pretty pronounced. Okay, so that's what the president can do. So that's what government policies are. We tend to think of public policy, and that's the term I use in the open slide. But there's corporate pledges as well. So there's a lot of companies who are saying, well, we're committed to be net zero carbon by the middle of the century, and they're doing real things about it. It's challenging, and we're working with a number of those companies to help them kind of analyze what their options are. And then you kind of combine the two, which is now again sort of within the Biden administration a more aggressive stance by the SEC and others for companies identifying what their climate risks are and making that part of their reporting requirements, their 10Ks. So there's kind of a lot changing on that front. Some of the people who were appointed or proposed to implement those had a hard time, and some did not get. They did not make it through the Senate process, and so they are no longer playing those roles. So that's kind of where we are. I said I would just close with one piece about where we sit within relative to the rest of the world. These are total CO2 emissions by country, basically since 1900. If we look at this figure, and again, sorry if it's hard to see, we see the US and Europe have traditionally been the large emitters. But we see, though, the current contribution is China's 27% greenhouse gas emissions. A good chunk of that is to produce things that we consume in this country. But not all of it. A lot of it is really their own homegrown emissions and their large and growing population. US about 15%, down from about 20-25%, EU 9%, and India 7%. If you look at the historical contributions, though, basically you look at the accumulation of that graph over time, you see still most of it has been the US and the EU and less China and India. So sorry if I ran on a little bit too long. I welcome you now at the end to interrupt me whenever you want. Let's try to say that at the beginning. But here we are. So I'm happy to take any questions that might come through the chat in the room.
Is there any hope that there might be some new technology come along that would be able to take large amounts of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere?
Yeah, it's called direct air capture, and it actually is working at pilot scale. So I was in Iceland last year. I was leading a Duke trip in Iceland, and Iceland is it's a pretty cool place to go. Basically all of their energy is carbon free. Because it's a combination of of hydro and geothermal, because they have a lot of both.
Mhm.
They are also one of the top aluminum producers in the world because they have a lot of really cheap electricity and they're near the water. So you can just ship the bauxite from Australia up to Iceland and they produce aluminum cheaply. But so they have very little emission footprint. And a lot of people are saying, well, we should just be able to do that in the United States, right? Well, anybody want to guess what the population of Iceland is?
It's less than the triangle.
It's the same as Durham
But
County. It's Durham County.
Really?
Yeah, Durham County and
Wow.
Iceland have the same population. So I actually brought that up and with the people that I was on a ship of 200 people, I said, Durham County, where I live, the sixth largest county and the 12th largest state in the United States. So anyway, let's put that into context.
Yeah.
But because direct air capture, that's removing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, is a very energy intense activity in and of itself. So when you want to do it, you want to do it in a place that has zero carbon electricity to do it. So it's very expensive, it's very energy intensive, but people are investing in it because essentially I feel it's amazing what we have seen in terms of energy technology innovation in the last 5 to 10 years. It's amazing to see how much money is being spent on it now. Therefore, I think, it's the private sector wasn't into it 10 or 15 years ago. The private sector is completely into it right now. And so I think you got to try all. I don't think we're going to get this sort of simple solution where everything's going to be wind and solar and batteries. I think we're going to have to be all over the world so that we're going to literally be producing no CO2 emissions. I think we're going to be producing CO2 emissions for a very, very long period of time. And we can remove them with forests, and that's a good thing. Forests are above ground and they can stay at risk, or we can remove them with direct air capture, or we can keep them out of the atmosphere by the carbon capture, CCUS. I tend to be less of a purist about what our solutions should be. I just think they need to be effective solutions that we think can work. And there's a lot of people in this field who are like, my solution is the solution and yours is the wrong solution. And I think there's going to be a lot of
A couple questions here. Bonnie wonders whether we should install solar power at our houses.
it would be hard for me to tell people to do it when I don't have it on my own roof, but I keep on waiting until I have to replace my roof before. Just like my gas furnace, but I do have an electric vehicle and I do have, we're just replaced the gas in our kitchen with an electric stove, but that question is, so I know a lot of people who do, and they're very happy with it. I think if I've sort of looked at it like utility scale is probably the cheapest way to get there. And so if what I'm pulling off the grid is getting cleaner and cleaner over time, like our law says in another 10 years, it's supposed to be a lot cleaner than it is right now. I think, that's certainly one way to go about it. I would price them out right after. So the electric vehicle I leased actually is that company that many of you have heard of. They also sell solar panels, and they say, well, we'll give you an estimate on what it costs to put solar panels on your roof, and oh yeah, whole house battery in your garage, and it was close to the cost of the first house I ever bought. But I think, but that was that company is selling me a super Cadillac version. But the prices have come down. I think it's $1 a watt now or something like that. But anybody here have them on their roof?
We looked at it
Mhm.
and it was gonna be like about a 15-year payback period.
Mhm.
And it was,
That's better than it used.
yeah, which is
Mhm.
better than it
Fun,
was,
yeah.
but it's like, wow, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And I think we could insulate and get a better return than
Mhm.
we were gonna get on.
Mhm.
There are lots of big companies doing loans, long-term loans
Mhm.
for them to match the repayment.
Well, and then there's other ways it's done in different parts of the country too, where essentially you've got the utility paying for it. And then you just basically have a deal with the utility that you sell them electricity for a certain price and they come out ahead and you come out ahead. So the big deal is like plopping down for a lot of people is popping down 25 grand, right? How do you get the money up front?
Yeah.
So if the companies go ahead and do that and finance it for you, that's the way to go.
My other church in Raleigh, they installed
Mhm.
solar panels and they got a bunch of grants
Mhm.
to do that. And it has really made a difference. It's a great big building. And so,
Yeah.
Yeah, where you start to get in trouble in North Carolina is not if you supply your own house, but if you produce enough to produce for someone else. And then they say, well, you're competing with the utilities. So,
so Bill Pogue asks a question. My understanding is that EVs require very high amps to recharge. Once we have a lot of EVs, will our grids be able to handle the current?
that's part of what needs to be part of the grid modernization. So when Duke Energy, for instance, puts together their carbon plan, that's going to be a big part. Like, we need to invest this much in transmission infrastructure and distribution infrastructure in order to handle the amps. I'll tell you, your house can handle it. If it can handle a dryer, it can handle a level 2 charger in the garage. Unless you have a whole bunch of dryers and other things, and then you might have to expand your panel.
And Bonnie asks, I think I heard you say that the US forest base is okay.
Yeah, I mean, if you compare it, like forest land is relatively stable in the United States. Part of that is because over the last 100 or so years, we've moved, agriculture is now produced on a much, much smaller base. So it produces other problems like nitrogen and pollution, factory farming, people call it. But it means less land is used to produce more food. And so that land has returned to forest. Again, if you take a look at pictures here of what Durham looked like around the turn of the 20th century, Duke Forest, there's pictures of Duke Forest, but it's Duke Farm, more or less, right? So if you go to Maine, which used to be less than 50% forested, it's 92% forested now, because potatoes aren't a very profitable way to make money on land up there. So, and part of it too is that, and a lot of forest land, a lot of private forest land in the United States is used for timber harvesting as well. So it kind of goes through a cycle. But if you've got thousands of acres, you're cutting pieces at a time, and it just kind of regulates through.
Peter, do you want to ask your question about recycling?
I do. Between 5 and 10 years ago, we started recycling as close to 100% of everything that formerly was disposable. Cans, paper, plastic, etc., you name it. And it all goes out every week or every other week to the company that does the recycling. But many of my friends, neighbors, relatives even say that, and I'm quoting here, not much of that stuff really gets recycled. Would you care to weigh in on that, please?
That is not much. I think, I don't know the exact number, but not all of it does for sure. And then there have been situations that I'm sure your friends are alluding to where they have barges floating around the ocean because there's no place to take the goods. And then I believe this is true at the beginning of the pandemic. China was taking a lot of our recycled waste, and then they kind of shut everything down. So we didn't have a place to send those. So like everything else in the world, there are bottlenecks. And I think part of the problem is there's been a lot of supply that's been sort of mandated, and then it's just so, I mean, remember when we first started recycling 25, 30 years ago, it seemed like you had to think about it all the time. Now you just don't even think about it, right? So it's easy to do. Somebody comes by and picks it up for free. Free.
Taxes.
Yeah. Or in our case, where waste management comes and picks it up for free. We pay them quarterly. But so the supply basically exceeds the demand because it's not, aluminum is almost all recycled and reused. Most of paper is recycled and reused. A lot of plastic is not. It's recyclable, but there's all different kinds of blends and varieties. And it's, now, Carol, you might know, or I guess you're doing less environmental now, more health. So you would have known the answer to this question 5 to 10 years ago. So.
Yeah.
So I remember when Durham went to this, I remember talking with Ted Voorhees, who was the assistant city manager, who had been the driver on moving to the big blue carts instead of just the little bins. And he said the money at the time was they were going from something like $5 a ton for landfill. So trash was $5, costing $5 a ton. Recycling ranged from we pay $2 a ton to we get paid 50 to 60 cents a ton, depending on market rates.
Exactly.
So some of that does go to the landfill, absolutely, but a lot of it doesn't, and it varies based on what the price of old plastic is this week or whatever it is. But it's still it's a much more efficient, from the municipality's point of view, it's a much more efficient approach than just shipping it all into a landfill.
Right.
Yeah.
Because then they get replaced a lot faster.
Yeah.
It's hard to build a new landfill.
Yeah, Chapel Hill a few years ago announced that they extended their landfills life expectancy by 10 years with the bigger recycling bins and weekly collection.
Yeah.
So
The one out
Yeah.
by Eubanks Road? Or,
yes,
yeah.
yes, that one.
Brian, I have a question. From what I heard tonight, I think I heard that one of the most important things for us to do is to support policymakers that have an environmental interest.
Yep.
And so regardless of how we recycle, seems like how we vote really matters.
That is very true. I didn't say that, but that is exactly when people ask me,
That's
what
the
can you
point.
do? It often starts with solar panels and things like that, but I mean, that's exactly right. That's where you actually have the impact, right? So, so the fact that we're 20% down in emissions, a lot of that has to do with policy. And what's interesting is environmental policy used to be very bipartisan. Nixon founded the EPA. It was, Republicans and Democrats. In fact, sometimes it was even the votes back in the 60s and 70s flipped the other direction of what we typically see now with environmental votes. And over time, it's grown more polarized. Some would say, well, it's, that's not, there's two sides to that story, and there may well be. But there are still like cases like North Carolina, very, the legislature, you wouldn't normally think of as a very green legislature, just passed some really green legislation. And part of it, to be honest, starts with when you made it easy to make money putting solar panels on your farm or or putting wind turbines on your farm, you created a whole new constituency who wants to make sure that you're not going to take that away. And that changed the politics of renewable energy and clean energy in North Carolina. Plus, it can be a real economic boon to certain communities, right? Like I took some students out there's one onshore wind facility in North Carolina near Elizabeth City. And we met with the farmers who have it on their property. We met with the local county commission. We met with the town manager. And they're like, we get all of this money from Avangrid, the people who run the wind turbines. It's 60% of our tax base. It just beat out, maybe it's between it and Walmart, it just beat out Walmart. So it's a huge cash infusion. Said, they built it 3 years before this. They're all going, we didn't have to build any new schools for like often if you build a new plant of something, you got the kids and you got to build new schools and new roads and whatnot. It's like, we didn't really have to pay much. And now they're funding our schools and our roads. And we were sitting inside a nice new courthouse and things like that during this conversation. So I hesitate. There's a lot of people who kind of get into the politicking of this and say it's all about creating these green new jobs. And it's like, yeah, but whenever you use money for anything, it creates jobs for somewhere. So if you're taking that money away from this and using it for something else, you are going to create jobs over there. But there would have been jobs created over there. You can't see them because that actually never happened. But you want to be smart about this. That said, you know, look at electric vehicles. Vietnamese company just announced they're building an electric vehicle plant, what, about 30 miles from here or something like that? Going to be a lot of employment associated with that, right? So the reality is these can be very high skilled labor situations. So that changes the political dynamic as well. It always does when, you know, all politics is local. If you're saying there's a pretty good deal, and even if you're like, I think renewable energy is hooey, and then somebody says, well, we're going to build a facility in your district, you're like, hooey.
Well, on that, I'm afraid we have to bring this to a close, but thank you so much, Brian. for-
Thank you for having me.
Invited Margaret to close us with a portion of the prayer of the Pope Francis.
Pope Francis, right. So this prayer is part of a longer prayer, which was given by Pope Francis in Rome at St. Peter's on Pentecost in 2015. Please pray with me. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen.
Thank you, friends, for being here online and in person.